Welcome everyone. In this video, we're going to be ranking all of the removal currently available in Vibes. Removal is one of the most important card types in any trading card game, and Vibes is no exception. So first in this video, we're going to first talk about what removal is and at a high level conceptual level. We're also going to talk about certain card types that are sort of removal adjacent, but I'm not considering them removal for this video. And then we're going to go through each piece of removal available and put it on the ranking board, either in rank D, C, B, A, or S. Now, note that the rankings are subjective based on kind of my experience and are subject to change as the meta changes or as new cards get released. For example, there could be a piece of removal that's really weak right now, but a new card gets released that combos really well with it, and then it could become much stronger. So let's dive in. So what is removal? So removal is either a penguin card or an action which removes a specific number of cards from your opponent's huddle into their ice. And so you'll notice that I said a specific number of cards because there's a whole classification of cards known as board clears that remove a large number of cards to the ice. But removal is very specific. So sometimes it can be one card, sometimes it can be two cards, but it's never all cards. And so that makes removal much more targeted. And so, right, like here are all the board clears. So I'm not considering these removal, although maybe in the broadest sense of the word, you could consider them removal. I've made a whole separate tier list video on all of the board clears. So I'm going to link that down below. So if you want to learn more about the relative strength of these, please go check that out. I also mentioned that removal is moving a card from your opponent's huddle into their ice. Now, there are a set of removal pieces that are what I'll call pseudo removal, and that's these three right here. And what they do is too much caffeine and hungry penguin both flop an opponent's penguin, which in most cases can act like removal because right when it's flopped, it can't use its action and can't win the vibe check. And then risk taking penguin returns the penguin to their hand. But the reason that I don't really consider these removal is it's just like a temporary band-aid on the situation. It doesn't permanently deal with it. And then in the case of flopping, right, they can also unflop it in response. So overall, we're not going to consider these three cards removal either. Although in certain situations, I definitely consider them pseudo removal. And certain decks that just don't have access to good removal end up playing these to kind of like fit in the role of removal. So when we talk about removal, right, there's a few ways it can work. One is you have an action card, and this is pretty straightforward. You have the action card, you play it, and the action card might say like remove ice a penguin or something like that. Or it can be an act ability that can be like flop, ice this penguin and ice an opponent penguin. And then there can also be triggers. And so, right, triggers happen to be like when a certain condition is met, then an icing happens. So those are the three types. I think they all have advantages and disadvantages. So yeah, so as we go through the list, yeah, we'll keep that in mind. Before we jump into the list, I also want to talk a little bit about my framework for assessing the different strengths of the removals. So the first way we're going to do that is just the cost of the removal, right? Like you want cheap removal, not expensive removal. The second thing is the card advantage built into the removal. So for example, right, if you have a removal that said ice two penguins and it's one card, right, that's great. That's card advantage. But if you had a removal that said when you play this, discard a card and then you ice one penguin, that's negative card advantage. So understanding the relative card advantage built into the removal will also impact how powerful it is. Then a lot of removals and vibes have conditions around them, right? They might say like ice a penguin with vibe 10 or greater. Well, are there a lot of penguins that you can target with that? Because if there's not a lot of penguins with vibe 10 or greater, that removal is not very good. Then it's like how easy is the counterplay to the removal? So for example, certain removals might say like select a penguin in your huddle and one in your opponent's huddle, and then ice the one that's vibing the least or the greatest. Like that removal, they can counteract it by icing the penguin like in reaction on the stack later, icing the penguin in your huddle, and then the removal will it will shatter and it won't happen. So because of that, like that effect of how easy the opponent can react to it, that will make removals that they can't react to are harder, are going to be ranked higher. And the last one is what I'll call is color synergy. So certain colors just have a lot more like built-in ability to benefit from removals. So I'll use the example of purple. So in purple, purple has phosphorus penguin, which basically just allows you to play a piece of your removal from the ice. And phosphorus penguin, right, is really good with two cost removals because it allows you to play a two cost action from your ice. So if the removal is in a color that has a lot of support, it will naturally just be stronger because right there'll be more ways to kind of leverage it in your deck. Okay, so let's jump into the ranking. So the first card that we're going to be putting in the D tier is Unlikely Friends. So Unlikely Friends is a piece of removal that is in blue that basically says choose a penguin in your opponent's huddle. That player may ice cards from the top of their deck equal to the penguin's vibe if they do not ice that penguin. So the reason I think this piece of removal is very weak is because it has a condition, but unlike the other conditions, your opponent doesn't even need to do anything besides just select if they want the removal to happen or not. Like most of the other removals, like they at least have to proactively play a card or take an action or do some sort of thing that requires them to have a specific card in their hand to react to it. Whereas Unlikely Friends, literally they can just pick what they want. And on top of that, they will always pick the option that's better for the specific game state situation. That being said, right, the way you would use Unlikely Friends is you'd have it in a deck where it's like, you set up a kind of a win-win for yourself where it's like, okay, well, if they ice the top cards of their deck, then I'm trying to deck them or I'm trying to get 15 cards for Send It Too Hard. So that's a win. Or I just ice their penguin. On top of that, in the late game, it can basically just be removal because like if they have like a bunkus or something giant, right, they're gonna have no option except for to allow you to ice a penguin. So overall, I think because this is such an inconsistent card and you really give the initiative over to your opponent to decide which way they want the condition to go, I'm putting it in tier D. The next one I'm putting in tier D is Bridge to Layer 0. Now, the reason that I put this also in tier D is because Bridge to Layer 0 is one of these pieces of removal that has negative card advantage built in. So basically, you're going to play a card, and then you choose a penguin in your opponent's huddle, swap it with the penguin cards in their ice, and then basically the that penguin enters a huddle. And so it's like kind of like they went from having one penguin to having one penguin. You go from having 4 cards in hand to having 3 cards in hand. So basically, you've lost one piece of card advantage by playing this removal. Now, there are certain situations where this card can be very strong, right? Because you can get rid of one of their really powerful penguins and put in some really weak penguin. But because the win condition in Vibes is really all about getting to 15 cards in your hand, or sorry, getting 15 cards on the board, then Bridge to Layer 0 is just, it doesn't really help you with that. So because of that, I'm also going to put this in tier D. The final card that's going into tier D is our first piece of removal that basically works off of a trigger, and that's Carnival Penguin. So personally, I love Carnival Penguin. It's one of my favorite red cards. However, I do need to recognize that it's not very strong, or at least it hasn't found its right support and cast yet. And so what it basically says is, whenever you play your third action of the cycle, choose a penguin with vibe 6 or less, ice that penguin. So on the face, this seems really, really strong because it's basically a repeating piece of removal. So you can over and over and over use it. And then right, it can actually have really good card advantage. However, what I found is it's just very difficult to meet these conditions. So first of all, you have to ice a penguin with vibe 6 or less, which can be good, but there's a lot of stuff that's above that. And secondly, playing 3 actions in a cycle can be very difficult to do unless you're just throwing away actions. Because right, you need each of those actions to be on their own like impactful. Otherwise, you're basically like, let's say you just play like 2 not a rod anymore just to trigger this, then all of a sudden all your card advantage is gone because you've just played 2 cards in order to ice one of their card. Furthermore, this is just a very expensive card. Like 7 fish is a lot. That being said, it is on a 10 vibe body. So very often I like this card as just like hey, you play it and it's just like a big beefy penguin they have to deal with. So I think there's definitely hope for this card. And I think maybe in the right tempo red deck, it could be very strong as a finisher. And I like it better than the other red finishers. But from a like removal perspective, it's very slow. It's very hard to activate. And so therefore, I'm putting it in tier D. The other thing that I didn't mention that's really nice about it is because it's a trigger, your opponent can't actually react to it. So like all the other removals that are actions or acts, they go on the stack. And when they're on the stack, right, your opponent can like counterplay it. But here they really have no option to counterplay because triggers resolve immediately. The next piece of removal is my favorite purple removal, which is have a philosophical debate. So have a philosophical debate basically just says like choose a penguin. You may move cards from your ice to the bottom of your deck equal to that fish's cost. if you do Ice that Penguin. So this is a really strong removal from the standpoint of, there's no conditions on your opponent that your opponent can react to. So it's basically similar to just saying ice, choose a penguin and ice it. However, moving cards from your ice to the bottom of your deck is a pretty significant additional cost you have to pay, because generally in purple decks, you're really trying to build up your ice. So this is one of those cards you kind of take advantage of having a big ice, but right, you have a lot of other cards that also want a big ice, like Bunkus, for example. And so there's kind of this like tension between, do I use my ice resource for have a philosophical debate or for another piece of removal? So because of that, it can be kind of tricky, or it can be hard to play these repeatedly, and especially against like big penguins. Like once you're starting to have to move like 10 plus cards just to remove a penguin, it can start getting very expensive. So because of that, have a philosophical debate is going in tier C. The next piece of removal is the ultimate Timmy card. So this is a card that is just super fun to play, and when you win games with it, it's it's super fun. And it's also one of these card advantage removals. And I'm referring to Luca saves the penguins. So Luca saves the penguin says choose a penguin in your opponent's huddle, it joins your huddle. So I guess this technically isn't removal from the definition of putting it in your opponent's ice, but I think it's even stronger than that because it actually brings it over to your side of the board. So it's not like something like returning to their hand where they can just replay it, but now you control that penguin. So overall, this is probably the most powerful piece of removal in terms of the effect. The problem with this card is it costs a lot. It costs 5 pudge, and it's in green, which is not a color that is known for producing a lot of pudge. Because yes, sure, there's the wizard, but other than that, green just generally has like fewer larger penguins and plays a lot of rods. So it really is like counter to the color it's in. And on top of that, right, even though it's really powerful, your opponent can play around it. Like very often, like people are trying to save this to play on that final turn to kind of mess up your opponent's win condition, but they can in response just flop their penguin by playing an action, and then you get a flop penguin. So it doesn't even help you on that turn. So you really need to then survive one more turn to really use that penguin. And sometimes the penguin you get doesn't even help that much because it's the wrong color, or it like is really synergistic with their board. Like for example, let's say you get a Bunkus. Right, the Bunkus might be a 24 vibe Bunkus on your opponent's board, but once it's over on your side, it might only be like, 6 or 8 vibe. So, because of that, Luca saves the Penguins goes into tier C. Our next piece of removal is our first of these like removals that require a condition on both sides of the board. And this is the green one, and I'm talking about Walk the Runway. So Walk the Runway says choose a penguin in your huddle and a penguin in your opponent's huddle, ice the one that's vibing the least. If it's a tie, ice them both. So Walk the Runway fits really, really well into green because green generally has bigger penguins. And so it allows you to get rid of little stuff like ascending penguins and penguin who's okay and stuff like that. Um, Plus, it really lets you like right. Green just doesn't really have that many good removal tools. However, your opponent can play around it by saying like, okay, so you select those two penguins, and in response, they ice your penguin, and then you end up getting actually 2 for 1 done against you. So Walk the Runway. Like I really think that makes these removals that require these like complex conditions on both sides of the board. I think they're really great from a card design standpoint because they make a lot of interesting game states, but it does make them weaker cards overall. But it's also 2 cost, which is standard for removal with conditions attached. So that's pretty good. And green really does need removals. The other problem with this is you can't actually take care of big things. And in vibes, like little things are annoying, but you really need to take care of big things in order to win that final vibe check. So it's really good in like the early mid game, but in the late game, it can be difficult to actually use it. Or I mean, you can use it, but not actually use it effectively. So because of that, Walk the Runway is going into tier C. The next piece of removal is our first removal that is basically an act ability on a penguin. And we're talking about Daydreaming Penguin. So, Daydreaming Penguin basically says when you use its action, it's choose a penguin with vibe 2 or less, ice that penguin, and ice this penguin. So, overall, it's basically just a small piece of removal on a penguin. And what makes these so strong is you don't have to use it. Like, right, yellow just loves having little penguins, especially ones that cost 2 fish, because those go really well with Penguin who might bring a +1. And so Daydreaming Penguin just has this really good, like, built-in deck it works in, basically every yellow deck. On top of that, it works well with Penguin Who Doesn't Mind Goodbyes because then you draw a card when it gets iced. It can also work well with Lucky Penguin because you can just play it repeatedly. And so, because of all those things, it's really strong. On top of that, there's a lot of two vibe penguins right now. So, we're talking about Penguin Who's Okay, Ascending Penguin, Popcorn Penguin in some situations. Although, right, it doesn't work well against Popcorn Penguin directly because, right, Popcorn Penguin, because it's a beginning of turn trigger, if there's just one on the board, it can't really take care of Popcorn. But if you play two of them, you can take care of Popcorn. So overall, it's very solid. It fits well in yellow, and it's very cheap. And so all those are the positives. The negatives are just like, yes, even though there's a lot of two vibe targets against certain decks, it just can't really find a good target. So because of all that put together, it's going into tier B, which is pretty much the average removal strength. Our next piece of removal is Sunburn a Penguin. So this is a red piece of removal that says choose a penguin with vibe 4 or less, ice that penguin. Now there's a huge difference between vibe 4 or less and vibe 2 or less because that just really opens up that you can almost always find a good target with Sunburn a Penguin. So not only can you take care of all those really pesky 2 vibe penguins, but there's a bunch of stuff in the 4 vibe slot such as Peace Out Penguin that are also good that this can be used against. So overall, or even like a popcorn penguin that's been buffed, with an inspiring story or something like that. So Sunburn and Penguin is just a really standard piece of good removal because of that. Its condition is not so onerous. Like you'll generally find something, but again, it's not really good in the late game. So it's a good beginning, early game removal for a red. And so yeah, I think there's not really much else to say about it. It is also just like it has all the advantages of being in action. But there's also disadvantages to that. So I think like because of that, it's just going into tier B. And the next one in tier B is going to be the kind of counterpart to Sunburn a Penguin, which is put on a show. And this basically just says choose a penguin with vibe 10 or greater, ice that penguin. So what put on a show does, it just basically allows red to get rid of any big penguins. So together, Sunburn a Penguin and put on a show basically give red a good toolkit to deal with everything with vibe 4 or less or 10 or greater, which is pretty much most of the board. So yeah, I don't know if there's much else to say about it except for like this can be hard to use because there's some decks that don't really get a lot of stuff over 10 vibe. So there are definitely some matchups where it's a dead card. So yeah, because of that, it's also going into tier B. All right. Now we're getting to the more premium pieces of removal. So the first one in tier A is going to be Adventure Squad. Now, Adventure Squad is kind of the opposite of Walk the Runway, where it basically says it's purple, 2 pudge, choose a penguin in your huddle, and a penguin in your opponent's huddle. Ice the one that's vibing the most. If there's a tie, ice them both. So, what makes this card, I think, so much better than Walk the Runway is purple really has a lot of small penguins and Adventure Squad. Therefore, it's like very easy to find a penguin on your side of the board. Like, it's much easier to find a good pair of something you actually want to ice on the opponent's side because really, like, big vibe penguins are what you win vibes with. And so, Adventure Squad helps you actually take out your opponent's win condition. Whereas Walk the Runway, you're often just like taking out either like a utility card on their side or some sort of early game penguin. So Adventure Squad is really, it really goes straight after their win conditions. So because of that, yeah, and like unlike the have a philosophical debate, which requires you to like move cards from your ice to the bottom of your deck, this card just doesn't have that extra cost. So I think the condition can have downsides because it is one of those that is definitely possible for your opponent to play around. Like when you play Adventure Squad, very frequently they will try to ice the penguin you've selected on your side of the board. But the good news is, generally, like right with Walk the Runway, when they ice a penguin on your side of the board, it's generally a big beefy penguin. But with Adventure Squad, you're generally choosing a little penguin you don't really care about that much. So that enables you to, you don't put as much risk on the board by playing Adventure Squad. So because of all of this, it's our first tier A removal. Our second tier A removal is going to be Bedtime Story. Now, Bedtime Story is also it's blue's premium removal, which basically costs 2 blue pudge, and it says choose a penguin with vibe less than or equal to the number of penguin cards in its controller's ice. Ice that penguin. What makes Bedtime Story so powerful is yes, it has this condition, but this is like one of the easiest conditions to meet, just because blue is like constantly icing cards from your opponent's deck, and on top of that, there's really no way they can play around it. So yes, I guess they can like remove cards from their ice. So like right, if they play Bedtime Story, you can react with a have a philosophical debate or something like that. But in general, it's very hard to play around. And the condition is not a free condition, but it's very easy to meet. And so because of all of that, I think it's one of the strongest two pudge removals. And so therefore that's why it's going into tier A. The final piece of tier A removal is not your keys. So not your keys is just the most basic piece of removal. Not your keys basically just says choose a penguin and ice it. Now, the downside of not your keys is that it's 4 pudge. 4 pudge is a lot. Like all these other removals were 2 pudge, and this is 4 pudge. So basically you're basically paying 2 extra pudge for the privilege of not having a condition. However, like this seems like a really steep cost increase, but something to keep in mind is of all the colors, yellow is the easiest for generating pudge. So first of all, you have not only the wizard penguin, but you also have pot stirring penguin. So you have two penguins that produce actually 2 pudge. And on top of that, yellow is just really a deck that's really designed about going wide on the board. So you generally have a lot of penguins. So I almost never find that it's a problem playing not your keys. Instead, it's like, oh, when I play not your keys, maybe I can't play 2 other actions that turn or something like that. So not your keys is super strong because of its lack of condition, and its downside of the 4 pudge is very manageable because it's in yellow. So because of that, it's our final tier A removal. All right, now we're into tier S. So these are the absolute premium pieces of removal. So the first one is going to be Peace Out Penguin. Peace Out Penguin is just insane. The reason it's so good is it's another one of these cards with card advantage built in. But unlike the other card advantage cards we've talked about, so that's Carnival Penguin and Luca, saves the penguins, Peace Out Penguin's condition is very easy to meet. It says you can only play this if you've played a red action this cycle, but red is all about playing actions. So you almost always play a red action with it. And secondly, its condition is just choose up to 2 penguins with total vibe of 10 or less, ice those penguins and this penguin. So you basically can remove 2 penguins from your opponent's board and 1 penguin from your board. So as long as you have a red action to play, so like let's say you play a Sunburn with this, then you'll end up getting a 3 for 2. The other thing about Peace Out Penguin is it is just part of one of the most devastating combos in the game. And I'm referring to basically you use again and again, which basically says that you can do the next action you play, you get to play twice basically. Then you play Trust Fall, which basically says reduce the vibe of a penguin by 2. If its vibe becomes 0, that penguin can't be iced this cycle. So you do that. You play again and again. Then you play Trust Fall on Peace Out Penguin, reduce its vibe to 0 because you've basically used 2 Trust Falls. And Trust Fall also says draw a card. So at this point, you've spent 2 cards, you've drawn 2 cards, and now you have the Peace Out Penguin that's at 0 vibe. You flop it, you ice 2 of your opponent's penguins, but then Peace Out Penguin doesn't actually get iced. And so then you can kind of just repeat the process next turn. Or if you want to go absolutely crazy, then you just also play a have an encore. And if you play have an encore, basically says unflop 2 penguins. You unflop the Peace Out Penguin, you flop it again. And so like you can get just absolutely insane card advantage from this. And so Peace Out Penguin is just so good against any deck that is like a penguin that's really board heavy deck, especially if it's playing small or mid-sized penguins. So like against yellow, this card is really, really good. Furthermore, like we talked about earlier with Sunburn and Put on a Show, red really has this blind spot between 5 and 9 vibe, but Peace Out Penguin can actually target penguins in that vibe. So it's really like the way that red bridges that gap between their two action-based removals. So because of all of that, Peace Out Penguin goes into tier S. The next piece of tier S removal is, of course, Got 'em. Got 'em is just insane. So Got 'em is one of the saucy actions, and what this basically means is you play this as a rod, and you can flip it over to play it. So it basically costs 0 pudge. And you can choose a penguin with vibe 2 or less, ice that penguin. So Got 'em is just really, really good because first of all, it can go into any deck. It doesn't have any conditions. And 2 vibe penguins, like we discussed with Daydreaming Penguin, there's a lot of good 2 vibe penguin targets. And what really makes Got 'em so strong is your opponent doesn't know you have it. So like they have to always be playing around it as if you have it. So for example, let's say that they play an adventure squad. You have no pudge, like all your penguins are flopped. So there's no way you can do anything to react to the adventure squad. They select a penguin on their side that has 2 vibe, and they select your Romulus that has 12 vibe. Then you can just, in response, play Got 'em to remove their 2 Vibe Penguin, which will then cause Adventure Squad to fizzle. So Got 'em is one of those cards that just like, you always have something, some way to react. And the reaction, icing a penguin that's 2 or less vibe, can just be really strong because it can really mess up whatever your opponent is planning to do. Plus, of course, Penguin Who's Okay, Ascending Penguin are also great things for it. On top of that, even Daydreaming Penguin. So let's say that you have a like Penguin Who's Okay that's out on the board. They play Daydreaming Penguin and they flop it in order to, they use the action to try to ice your Penguin Who's Okay. You then, in response, use Got 'em, and when you do that, you can basically ice their Daydreaming Penguin, and then that means that its action will fizzle because, right, just remember that an action, whenever a penguin does an action, it will only resolve if that penguin is on the board at the time of resolution. So because of all of that, Got 'em goes into tier S. All right, we're down to the final card in tier S. And so if you didn't already figure out what it is, it's Popcorn Penguin. Now, Popcorn Penguin is just an absolute powerhouse right now. So, what Popcorn Penguin says is at the start of action time, ice a penguin that's in play that's vibing the least. If it's a tie, you pick. So, already built into this is insane card advantage. So, unlike the other pieces of removal, which are like limited, it is a piece of removal that happens turn after turn after turn. Um, on top of that, well, I guess the one exception is Carnival Penguin, but the condition here is so much easier to make happen than Carnival Penguin, and the cost is so much lower. So let's say your opponent has two vibe penguins. So you play Popcorn Penguin. So then immediately on the when you go into the vibe check, Popcorn Penguin will ice one of them. Now, that's the other thing with Popcorn Penguin is because it's a trigger, your opponent cannot react to that trigger. I mean, they can react with their own triggers. So like if like both people are playing popcorns, right? There's like this whole game about buffing and icing and stuff like that. But in general, like just in the standard setup, right? You immediately then can ice 1 2 vibe penguin. And as we've talked about before, there's a lot of good 2 vibe penguins to hit. So once you've iced the 2 Vibe Penguin, now your opponent is faced with a choice. They have your Popcorn Penguin on there, and they can just remove it. But if they remove it and they spend a piece of removal on it, they've now spent 2 cards because there was a 2 Vibe Penguin that was iced and their piece of removal to get rid of your card. So Popcorn Penguin kind of is already a built-in 2 for 1. I mean, there's ways they can play around it. Like for example, they could use like a Mega Penguin to ice their small penguins, or maybe a Penguin who zooms or something like that. But in general, you almost always get a 2 for 1 card advantage as long as they have a deck that plays a lot of small penguins. The other thing is with Popcorn Penguin is you can actually buff it. So like if you play an inspiring story or a sliding penguin, all of a sudden your Popcorn Penguin has 4 vibe. Now you can remove everything on your opponent's board that's 4 vibe. Then you buff it again. Now all of a sudden it's 6 vibe. So Popcorn Penguin, this like package of Popcorn Penguin with buffs, is one of the most common packages found in decks right now. So yeah, so because of that, Popcorn Penguin is just, it's like really can be this like game winning engine. Whereas the other pieces of removal are more like auxiliary utility cards. Popcorn Penguin really on its own can actually win games for you. So, well, and I guess Peace Out Penguin kind of can also if you really build that combo around it. So anyway, because of that, Popcorn Penguin goes into tier S. All right, so that's all the pieces of removal that I could find in the current Vibes card set. So if you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you want to find out more about whenever I drop new content. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all next time.